publications from any of the NATO nations, really, looking at the future of warfare, you see urbanization turning up in virtually every single one of these publications, and they all acknowledge that it's a thing. It's already shaping the way operations take place. You only have to look at the news to find out where a lot of military operations are taking place, having to be in and around towns and cities. And yet, when I was working with defence, there was no on things like future force development or procurement. There seemed to be no reflection of that. So I started getting more and more down this rabbit hole of urban operations, trying to understand it more, trying to figure out, like, am I missing something? Are we actually already prepared for it, or are these capabilities we're procuring, are they actually okay for urban operations? And then getting more involved over time with specifically land warfare. That became my focus area. And I ended up moving over, and I only work on land operations work now within DSTL. So that's how I got into urban. There weren't that many research questions coming in about urban, so once one came in and I worked on that, and then the next one came in, they said, who has experience of urban? Mine was the only hand went up. So that cycle just perpetuated. So so I'm the urban guy within DSTL, and so for a long time was one of the few people working solidly on this within UK MOD. But that wasn't by design, that was just by default. Hence, your comment is a bit niche. So yeah, that's where we got to here.
How many of you work on urban in DSTL as a sort of percentage? Because I think this is also important. I've met military officers who are, I'm the SO2 urban, and they are literally the only person doing urban in that particular organisation. It might not look that way from the outside.
It kind of is that way from on the inside. So the British Army has said on a number of occasions that urban is a growing trend. It's something we need to prepare for. They've done a whole series of larger pieces of work looking at urban operations, where we will surge more people whenever there's a larger research project going on. But when it comes back to sort of the steady state, it falls back to very, very few. There might be people who are working in, I suppose you could call it urban adjacent work. So there's people looking at subterranean operations, trying to do sort of subterranean find, subterranean navigation, those sorts of things. So I think you probably, if you were to use an umbrella term of all of the things that would fall under sort of urban, there might be more. But in terms of people who look at urban close combat, urban fires, etc., it's pretty small. It's usually me and occasionally surging a couple of extra people, and I don't necessarily always have my full time used up doing urban operations either. So, like I say, yeah, it's a bit niche, but I said probably shouldn't be.
Just because Fight International is wargaming centric or wargaming adjacent, depending on how you envisage that. There is an article up there which mentions wargaming and urban operations. So if you could just very briefly mention your wargaming credentials, that might help people for some targeted questions at the end.
Yeah, so Wargaming is a tool that we use quite extensively within DSTL. I don't know if you can read it there, but I've got the Defense Wargaming Center also on my t-shirt. It's something that we use an awful lot to contextualize the analysis and the work that we do to try and illustrate various topics or to stress test force structures, etc. I've been involved with my urban hat, developing some of the urban specific either war games or urban specific aspects of war games within DSTL. Wargaming is certainly something that, because of the limitations of what you can do in a physical training estate, and you can't necessarily, or it's very hard to build an urban training estate that's large enough to do large-scale maneuver warfare. And certainly, you can't really apply the full spectrum of kinetic effects that you would like to, using your joint fires and your direct fire systems in that training area. So actually, wargaming is a particularly useful tool from a training perspective as well. So one of the things we've been doing is to try and promote that. It's not just us as well. So while DSTL uses wargaming quite a lot, I work a lot with the Land Warfare Center and within the Land Warfare Centre there is the Urban Centre, and they use a wargaming. They use a number of different wargame methods to actually go to units and either do sub-unit level training or unit level training, so battalion level, battle group, and then they've also done brigade and divisional level war games as well, and they contextualize it into that warfighting context, putting the full spectrum. They've got some amazing tools that they use, three-dimensional mapping and everything. Really kind of draws the players into the game and contextualizes a lot of that doctrine that people will talk about, but unless you're training at that the micro tactical sort of platoon level, really, you never really get to do it outside of wargaming. So yeah, so that I work closely with them as well. So yeah, I'll try to get as many fingers in as many sort of urban wargaming pies as I can.
That's great. I'm sure we're going to hit some of that on the training side. I'm just going to plug as well that we had John Spencer on a couple of years ago from Urban Warfare, which is a very interesting primer to this conversation if you want to understand why we have fights in urban areas and a more macro view. But for this particular one, we're going to try and keep it down at the tactical level. And I see you co-authored with John and also Jason from Canada. So you've got a sort of three eyes, little cadre there for writing that article on breaking NATO's cult of the urban defense. So with that, I'll move us on to the sort of framework, the first of two frameworks that we're going to try and talk through. Now, this is my own work, so apologies for being egotistical here. But I actually think I was borrowing from CGS, who was talking about thought, which, if you think about it, is very obvious, but often we have examples where we are shortcutting that paradigm or we are going the wrong way through that cycle. So the logic or start point is you're thinking about urban operations and then urban combat tactics. You teach them throughout your organization, and that creates muscle memory and buy-in, and then you apply them and you fight. But also there is adaptation, which could almost be a mini spiral coming off that, which is true in every war. So it's never going to be 100 with the tactics you have at the start, not the tactics you have at the end. And Ukraine war is a great example of rapid technological and tactical adaptation. So that is also going to feed back either during the war or after the war, how you think about urban operations, to the point that you might not want to even do them anymore, which is something we can cover as we go through our epochs, which then feeds back how they're taught. But I think the point on the arrows is that the temporal aspect of how quickly you move through can be quite slow in peacetime and quite rapid in wartime. Therefore, you can have, especially when you're not at war but others are, the thinking and teaching could lag behind examples of the fighting. I think that's what we're going to get to in our examples. But I'll hand over to the teacher and let you critique my very simple infantry diagram.
Well, I like it, and actually, going back to your title of Dad's Army and the Donbas, Dad's Army in particular. I'm a huge fan of what the Home Guard did. In fact, actually, the Home Guard doesn't get enough credit in the pioneering work, and I don't use that like they were trailblazers when it came to the development of urban tactics and doctrine. Despite the TV show and people's imagery of old men walking through fields, the Home Guard's specific role was about defending towns and villages. Now, that came about because of the scare that happened with Blitzkrieg. I know it wasn't called that for any of the Doctrine nerds that are listening, but for the Battle of France, with the introduction of Fallujah and the Panzer armies, the British were looking at a way to defend the UK if the Germans did come across. So the shock of the fight for the Battle of France made them think, right, well, what are we going to do? We created the Home Guard with specific focus on defending towns and villages. It was urban strong point defensing. We can go into strong pointing and discuss that because it's slightly more nuanced. But the idea was that the Home Guard, because they didn't have vehicles to move around, their job was to defend the towns and villages. So they were about urban defense in that complex terrain. And there was no urban doctrine at that point. Nobody really had anything significant. So there was a bunch of enterprising individuals who looked at what had happened in the Battle of France, looked at how you would defend towns and villages, and they just put in the hard yards doing thought experiments and doing effectively sort of war games and Duffer's Drift style sort of thought experiments of how they would actually defend a given area. And they wrote all this up and they produced what was the first urban tactical doctrine. It was all produced. So there were civilian publications, and Home Guard units would go and buy them, have a whip round and buy copies of these. And that what they managed to achieve in 1941 or 1940-41 is phenomenally consistent with what we taught throughout the whole of the Cold War, and what we're trying to get the army to revert back to, and when talking about high intensity peer warfighting today. So I have literally taken copies of it and given it to the instructors at the infantry battle school at Brecon and said, read this, it's brilliant, from something that was published in 1941. So they don't get enough credit. What they did, they absolutely nailed the thought aspect of this. They'd seen what had happened in the fight. They put the time in and the thought, and then they taught it not just to the Home Guard, but then to the regular forces, who then used it on operations to liberate the rest of Europe. And then that then became established Western military doctrine for urban ops. So yeah, and it's a lot of the stuff they did has stood the test of time in the next fight, and we just reverted back to it again and again and again. So yeah, my little sort of fanboy shout out to the Home Guard there.
Yeah, I think I bought for a couple of quid the handbook, which might have been a bigger book that's been split into house to house defending of villages, and what I'm struck with is the brevity that the document. Most document handbooks are really thick, and this is very much to the point. It just says it how it is, with very pragmatic advice that you could read and apply without needing to go through a long period of tuition and study. And I wish we had a simple approach to this today with a lot of our doctrine, because it seems to be sort of justifying itself intellectually rather than just telling me what I should do, which, as we get to the threat of a mobilized army, which hasn't been through many years of military PME, just needs to get the key details, needs to get the recipe and not the sort of like the art of cooking. It needs to just get the practical stuff as fast as possible.
Absolutely, and it's the sophistication of some of the tactics they explore in actually quite short levels of prose as well. So yeah, the nuance and the sophisticated way that they understood the nature of the terrain and that type of fighting was absolutely spot on. And like you say, these are not weighty tomes. They're 80 pages long. They're not with diagrams, with hand-drawn diagrams to illustrate as well. I think they're fantastic.
I'll stick some in the show notes so people can follow up. Okay, here's our timeline slide. We're not going to go through all these battles as a case study. This is the breadth of the sort of era we're talking about, 1940s to present day. You mentioned the Home Guard, so again, there's a nature of this, which is fighting in the urban is normally a decision made by a defender to capitalize on the terrain to gain some form of advantage. But again, there's a debate about how much of an advantage and whether it's always an advantage and whether the attacker has an advantage, and we can explore that. But generally speaking, in these examples, somebody chose to fight in the urban area, and somebody was probably less disposed to willingly to fight in the urban area, at least initially, and then had to make a concerted effort. So starting on the left, we've got examples from World War II, such as Ortona in Italy, Caen and Aachen in Western Europe in 1944. I've tried to steer away, other than Grozny, from the sort of Russian or Eastern examples, because the application of mass, whilst a useful lesson, is often very difficult for us to take away on our side. So I'll try to stick to the Western experience. And clearly at that point, this was a world war, so a lot of risk tolerance was going on, which wasn't necessarily the case thereafter. But as Anthony King mentions, army fronts were covering the breadth of the entire nations. So a city was actually a minor speed bump in macro terms. Well, as we move through the slide, a city becomes a major obstacle for a small professional force because it cannot dominate enough of it, and the people themselves can be a huge consideration factor. Whereas in World War II, a lot of the time the people were civilian population, either unfortunate casualties or had already evacuated because they knew what was coming, and or the majority had evacuated. I should say, there's always going to be civilians in it. Then we move into the Cold War, which, again, conceptually from the highest level, saw nuclear engagement and large conventional forces in the rural plains of northwest Germany. So the actual intention to fight in the urban was probably limited to West Berlin and maybe some German towns and cities. The two examples I picked here from the Korean War and the Vietnam War. So Seoul, very much more conventional. This is the fight for Seoul after Incheon landing. So the UN forces attacking, very much borrowing from its World War II predecessor. So linked very close in time and therefore borrowing. By 1968, which still, I'll let you come in on this, even though it's only another 18 years later, actually a lot of that World War II knowledge had potentially been forgotten because of the focus on counterinsurgency or pacification.
Yeah, completely forgotten. None of the forces deployed had any pre-deployment training in urban. They were going to Vietnam. They were going to fight a jungle war. It wasn't what they were expected to do. Most of the forces who were involved in the retaking of Hue had the week before been in the jungle conducting counterinsurgency, find and strike operations, and were ripped from there to then go in and retake the city. So there's a famous incident where one of the battalion commanders, a guy called Ernie Cheatham, he actually dug around inside this foot locker that had a load of pamphlets in it, and he found an urban fighting pamphlet that was printed in the 50s, so more related to Seoul, and he read that the night before going in to retake some of the provincial capital buildings. So yeah, they were absolutely learning on the job, which is slightly disconcerting because Seoul is actually an example that really influences the way that staff colleges and especially the American military think about it. They study Hue a lot, which is interesting because they're studying an example where somebody wasn't prepared and was learning on the job, and none of the units were talking to each other either. So you have instances of units making the same mistakes as the people who were put in the week before and having to relearn the same mistakes during the same battle. So it's quite a challenging case study to sort of use as the tent pole for your for your learning about urban operations. I'd argue we should probably look at other ones, but it is still a fascinating case study at how people were able to adapt.
Yeah, I also think Hue is an interesting one because rather than it being a known enemy city that was occupied, that was then fought through like Seoul, they infiltrated into the city, which was garrisoned by army and US troops, and then they attacked from inside. So we will probably come back to the concept of infiltration for the other ways later.
Yep.
Now, the end of the Cold War, so I'm calling this Cold War because it's not yet GWOT. So both the US and the Soviets / Russians, apologies, I spelled Grozny wrong in my haste to throw these slides together. Around about 1993-94, both had an experience of urban fighting, which did not go entirely as planned. One more surgical on the idea of sort of a raid, quick in, quick out, overwhelming speed of action with aerial delivered firepower. And then the Russian method, which you can see on the picture, the map destruction. Lots of armor, lots of conventional artillery, lots of damage, and indiscriminate violence against people in the area. But neither army came away feeling particularly validated from those experiences. Stu, you got anything quickly on those two?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the Mogadishu one is another example where everybody's aware of. A lot of people have read Black Hawk Down. Most people have seen the movie. But yeah, that's one where we have to be careful of context and understanding that you mentioned it was very much a surgical strike operation. They'd certainly been turned down from having armor and actually being able to use armored vehicles to move into the city. Some of the TTPs that were applied, so one of the reasons why the Black Hawks were vulnerable was because they were applying counterterrorism tactics to a high intensity, not necessarily counterterrorism role. So they were using them as aerial sniper platforms, which was a TTP that Delta had been using quite extensively in their training in that counterterrorism role. Then they applied it in a role that wasn't really suitable for, and it did put the helicopters more at risk. And they've subsequently come out and said that that was a failure on their part to really adapt to the changing nature on the ground. So yeah, again, we're seeing a lot of examples here. Ortona, Khan, to some extent Aachen as well. None of these examples are armies where they've been prepared for the fights that they've gone into. So we do really struggle finding examples where people have actually put the time in to really kind of get themselves ready for this specific fight before they go into it. In a way we don't really see with other environments. If somebody's going to a jungle war, they tend to go off and do some jungle school training. We tend to have these examples with urban where people just get thrown into it and expected to learn on the job. So yeah, there's always challenges with all of these case studies. You read them at the beginning and you're thinking, okay, could this have been done differently? And invariably the answer is yes.
And then we get into the global war on terror period, which, other than this sort of initial invasion of Iraq 2003, this is where we see some big siege and then clearance, or clearance and then siege options, which is higher level than I want to go for this topic, but there's various ways you can do urban in a siege or encirclement. The language is often quite sensitive about if you say it's a siege. But the idea of second Fallujah and second Marawi being two different examples of it, because second Marawi was informed by the experience of second Fallujah. Now 20 years in the rearview mirror, and these were the last time the West, primarily the US, fought in an urban area against determined resistance. So, any comment on how that's sort of leading into the stuff on the right where we're off there?
No, I think that's good. Second Ramadi was a much more nuanced operation. Fallujah was more the classic break in and clear with combined arms. Interestingly, the commanders for the Battle of Ramadi were specifically told, don't do a Fallujah. So they were told right from the get-go, do something different, and they actually managed to achieve that. And it took longer, but actually it was very, very successful.
That's good. I mean, that's a good example of the thoughts to talk kind of rapid feedback, I suppose. Then we get into the what I would call recent wars. And again, this is just a selection. There's many more examples you could talk about. Mosul being sort of counter ISIS as well, so very, very in the sort of GWOT frame. But the point here is it was done largely by what we would say would be proxies, yes, with equipping and training from the West, but with a very different probably casualty calculus than us. And that took 9 months to clear, whereas up until this point, most of the urban battles have been sub 1 month. Grozny is a sort of 2-year kind of like ongoing weeping sore. But a lot of the urban fights were over in a couple of more days, depending on where you drew the line from when the urban bit started and when the urban bit ended, because there was normally a lot of fighting in the rural outskirts, which gets wrapped into the timeline. Mosul was a 9-month slog. Mariupol was not 9 months, but was a pretty big slog as well. And then operations in the Middle East have been, repeatedly shown to be dragging on longer than the original military planners intended. So, thoughts on that stack of examples, and you could bring in any more that you think are relevant. You'll go over power back beyond what I've sort of missed off.
Yeah, I think one of the key things that's different for a lot of these examples is the heavy use of precision fires in a way that was not necessarily for other operations. You could include that in the American examples there to some extent, but we really saw this come to the fore with Mosul, which is where you get so Amos Fox came up with the precision paradox about the nature of using precision fires to reduce civilian harm and collateral damage, as well as own force casualties. Given the nature of this terrain and the length of the fire chain, by the time you deliver the effect, the target has moved to the next location. In which case, you then play whack-a-mole, but you're doing it slowly because you're trying to use these precision fires assets. So we really saw that come to the fore. That really was encapsulated by Mosul. Mariupol returned back to the high intensity conventional combined arms fighting, certainly where you had peer on peer conflict. Mariupol still took about 3 months for the Russians to take that, fairly early on when they were still fresh. Their initial Russian ground forces actually struggled quite heavily, and they had to bring in the naval infantry, who had an additional level of training on top of that to try and really sort of clear that. Yeah, so Mariupol's a really good example of some of the more the return to that peer on peer high intensity warfighting. There's an example there, another one that I'd like to highlight, which is from 2017. It was overshadowed by Mosul, but it was the Filipino Battle of Marawi in the southern Philippine island of Mindanao, and that was a very punchy counterinsurgency fight by the Filipino armed forces. Still took about it was about 5 months of fighting to clear part of a city, which wasn't particularly big either. There was about 1,000 insurgents in there. But interestingly, one of the things that differentiates that from Mosul is you had the Filipinos they were better trained in combined arms integration, so they were doing combined arms fighting at that lower tactical level in a way that we didn't really see the Iraqis do. It was mostly light roll supported by coalition fires. And then the other key aspect of the Battle of Marawi is that the Filipino armed forces ran out of precision-guided munitions in the first within 3 weeks of the battle starting. So they had to rapidly figure out how do they do close support artillery and airstrikes using conventional munitions in terrain where it was very, very narrow streets. You're literally fighting from one house to the next. So they did a phenomenal job to being able to clear that out. And that's a case study that I certainly used to teach at the Defence Academy, and it's one that I recommend certainly for those people who are in smaller militaries to look at, because of the size of the footprint that the Filipinos could actually apply into that fight, and things like stockpile issues and stuff, and how that shaped that tactical fight at the street level. So yeah, that's another good example.
Yeah, so an observation here is that there are a lot of case studies that people can point to, which is both good because you get a breadth of different data sets, but also people can cherry pick the ones they want to push a narrative or a perspective that they want to reinforce. And you might have some examples of that. But the question I'll use to wrap this up is, in your opinion, what is it that people get the most wrong, or people get wrong the most about urban warfare?
I think there's quite a few things people get wrong about urban warfare, and that's a whole thing in itself. But I'll try and keep it to tactical level and try and sort of contain myself. So I think the first thing would be that everyone seems to think that's an infantry fight. Now, I absolutely, I'm an ex-infantry, so it very much is the foundation of an urban operation is infantry, and the infantry really are the lead element when it comes into that. The nature of that urban terrain means that, and certainly once you start applying your joint fires to it, and suddenly the buildings start to degrade, you start to get rubble, which makes it difficult to move vehicles around, or you go into a really dense urban area where it's hard to get vehicles down streets, etc. It really does lend itself to being an infantry-led fight, but it is never just an infantry fight. So whenever I see infantry units going off to train in urban, and it's just an infantry company, they haven't got any engineers, they haven't brought any other attachments, so specialist signal units, they haven't got any attached armor, even just we've even said to people, bring a pickup truck and have somebody, you know, with a GPMG up on top of it, and make it pretend that it's an armored fighting vehicle, just to give you that sense of how does your infantry interact with attached armor, or attached vehicles, etc. Yeah, so that aspect of, you know, it being purely seen as an infantry fight is incorrect. Yes, they are absolutely the foundation and they're the lead, but you need all of those other enablers around it. So yeah, people will say things like, you know, armor doesn't work in urban, so don't worry. You know, we just need to put the infantry in. Absolutely, get the armor in there. We've seen all the historical examples, and the analysis shows that when you attach armor to that infantry, their chances of success and the reduction of friendly casualties is significant. And actually, historically speaking, armor has better survivability in an urban area than they do trying to cross open terrain against prepared defensive positions. So, you know, absolutely, it is a combined arms fight, infantry led, and as the foundation, but it is absolutely a combined arms fight. And if you're not thinking about it in those terms, then you're kind of getting it wrong. And I think kind of leading on from that is the obsession with CQB. I'm not somebody who is against CQB. I think it is something that we do need to practice, that does need to be taught. But just to, you know, I know you talked about cherry picking examples, but I'll use a historical example for this. When the Americans went in the Second Battle of Fallujah, because of the limitations of what people could train, most units were training for CQB. And then for the first 3 days, they were trying to apply CQB tactics when they were in that fight. And they were breaking into buildings. And there was an insurgent inside wearing a suicide vest, armed with a PKM, and 2 syringes of amphetamines already in his system, and willing to go to heaven. So ultimately what ended up happening was an awful lot of casualties in those first few days. And after about 2 to 3 days of this, everyone did a recock and said, right, from now on, if you take resistance from a building, you drop the building. And they went back to what we would term sort of World War II tactics, where you approach a building, you identify it as a threat, somebody moves forward with a satchel charge and throws it through a window, and the building gets deleted, or use an armored vehicle to knock holes in the wall to get entry into, or you put Bangalore torpedoes through windows, all those sorts of things, those more high intensity type TTPs. And what you see from that point onwards is the rate of casualties among the American forces drops significantly. So understand the nature of the fight that you're going into. So yeah, you might need those CQB tactics. If you're clearing multiple buildings and you're not necessarily taking fire from all of them, you need to be able to safely move through buildings. But that is not the only thing. And we have different patrol formations for different types of terrain and different contexts, for operating in rural spaces. If most anybody who's got an infantry background will know that there's different formations and apply them differently. But when it comes to urban operations, we seem to think that CQB is the only way, and it's trying to get people to think, there's some nuance to this. Maybe you want to try something different. So yeah, kind of linked there. So I got away with 2, if you don't mind.
No, that's good. It's good. Just before I get off the timeline slide, we've slipped slightly into the themes, but given the arc of history, do you think we're seeing more urban combat, or is this just a kind of like an up-down sine wave and it's kind of just part of the course?
So I think we are seeing a higher proportion of urban combat, I think, is probably the better way of saying it. So you mentioned World War II, and what Anthony King said about how as armies got smaller, the focus on urban operations becomes higher. I would completely agree with that. I'd say even in World War II, when we had armies of, we had dozens of divisions deployed into places like Normandy, we still had to go and clear towns and villages. We still had to seize large urban areas because they became where the ground lines of communications went through, or they became that critical infrastructure you needed, that mission vital infrastructure that you needed for the next thing. So suddenly places that nobody would have ever heard of, like Garlikirchen or even Bastogne, suddenly took on a significance beyond the sum of their urban parts because of the nature of the terrain around them. So for Bastogne, it's a tiny little village in the middle of nowhere, but it's where 7 roads came together in dense wooded forests. So that became the focal point for a strong defense. To try and take that. Garlikirchen was about opening up the ground lines of communication from the ports in Antwerp to then be able to bring forward supplies and then progress the campaign forward into Germany. So, these are, even during World War II, when we had these huge armies that could theoretically bypass and avoid, we still had these instances where people had to go in and take these things because of the nature of the terrain. They weren't a nice to have, they were an essential in order to be able to allow campaigns to progress.
Yeah, what I found in my research before this was Brest, which I wasn't really tracking. But again, taking ports, we often forget this, that the ports tend to be cities. So if you want a port, you need to take, and our popular media is about taking beaches or taking ports from the front, as opposed to fighting through ports from the back in the city space, and not using the navy from the front end.
Or even things like bridges at Arnhem. They went into Arnhem because that's where the bridge was. There's all these examples as to why there's a patch of infrastructure. There's a reason why you have to take urban areas. People don't just do it for the for the vibes. There's reasons why these things have to take place, and sometimes it's unavoidable. And there are examples of corps commanders being told go and do this, and them saying I don't really want to do it, and they're saying, well, we don't really care. You kind of have to do it. So.
Okay, so what I've done is given us 10 urban tactical themes to focus us in. Of course, we reserve the right to go completely tangential off any of this. This should try and keep us at the tactical level. So I've gone for movement techniques, clearance methods, clearance techniques, battle drills and SOPs. They will blend back into the other two. Task ordering and teaming, weapons and effects mixtures, combined arms integration, defensive approach, training realism, adaptation and learning, and autonomy and robotics, which is clearly a sort of presentism aspect that we might not have got from our case study discussion. So I don't know if you want to sort of try and attack this by where we were at the end of World War II with some of this stuff, just a baseline us.
Yeah, so by the end of World War II, we'd pretty much nailed down most of the TTPs about things like how do you actually move down a contested street? How would you clear a given urban area? We had our doctrine was pretty swept up by that stage. We had examples of various scenarios that were fairly universal, clearing 2 rows of streets down a terrace road, or 2 rows of buildings. How would you do that as a platoon task? Mouse holing, going through walls, not necessarily going through the doors. Those were all things that we had pretty nailed by World War II. I would say right. So, do you want me to go through? Sorry, do you want me to go through all of these from the end of World War II,
No,
and then we'll go back?
Just pointing out the ones, but like as an example, you already mentioned like there was a preference more for high explosive or firepower clearances versus what we would call today's CQB. I mean, but another example I might highlight is that the standard section was broken into like a cover group, normally with the Bren gun or Bren guns, and then you might have had assault pairs, and that actually carried on through until relatively recent. But as an example of not necessarily having a bespoke task organization that you, as in if you build up a certain, like you are the cover group in perpetuity and you look like this, but the idea that the section was able to do stuff by breaking itself down into small battle buddy teams and echeloning through. So examples like that, and if anything, like we can mention flamethrowers and the weapon effect mix as an example of a particularly suited weapon system for clearing physically or psychologically an urban area.
So in terms of the movement as well, one of the things we had at that stage was there was an awful lot of individual capability. So it sounds really noddy, but every soldier had a toggle rope. And we trained people for using those to move very rapidly between levels in urban areas and being able to pull each other and equipment up through between buildings. And actually, you could tie them all together and make a bridge in between buildings if you needed to. So that was something that we were actually very, very comfortable with, being able to move through those environments. And certainly at that stage, the soldier wasn't weighed down by body armor and all heavy radios and all the other stuff. So we had that pretty nailed in World War II. The clearance methods, assault versus high explosives, except that was very much the norm. You know, we had things like direct fire. You could direct fire the 2-inch mortar from the platoon and use that as a sort of very tactical micro assault gun. We would use things like explosive entry into walls. If you had a building that was being defended by somebody who really didn't want to leave, then it was you attach satchel charges to it. And we've got examples of people doing that. Ortona is a good example where buildings were allowed to be occupied and then dropped, or you would identify a building that was identified, and rather than trying to fight for it, you just move forward undercover and place satchel charges on them and blow them up. There were some CQB tactics. There were, because not every building needs to be fought over, but you do need to be able to safely move through it on the off chance there is a defender. So we did have some CQB tactics, but really the focus was on how you actually fight through an urban area. And so that really was the primary one. So there's an awful lot of instructional videos, but also training schools on how to actually patrol through and actually fight through multiple objectives, not just the fixation on CQB once you're inside the building. Battle drills and SOPs. Yes, you mentioned the cover group and the assault pairs. That is pretty standard stuff. That hasn't really changed. We still have in Doctrine today, you break the section down by into a cover group led by the section 2 IC and having the support weapons, and the assault group, which is led by the section commander. That hasn't changed. And when you do break in, then usually it is breaking into pairs to clear rooms. So some of the individual TTPs have changed. At that stage, we were very much taught to teaching guys to do speculative fire into likely pieces of cover. So you break into a room and there's a beautiful antique French wardrobe there. It's like, well, don't be shy with the Sten gun. Put a couple of rounds into it because somebody might be in there. That's something that we're trying to get people to think about again when you're moving back to sort of the high intensity side of things. Task organizing, I said, yeah, it was very much the same. Infantry teaming, infantry-led combat teams. We would break down tanks, 2 tanks attached to a platoon or a company going through. It was all very task organizational. There was no set structure to it, but that was very much the way that it was envisaged, and that's again kind of carries on exactly as it is, as it was developed in the 1940s. Weapon mix, small arms. Bear in mind they had bolt action rifles, so still relying on the bayonet a lot for some of the CQB. So CQB drills we had bayonet drills for in close proximity. You're already in close proximity with the bayonet on the end of an SA-80 because it's a carbine length weapon. But with something like the Lee Enfield number 4, actually being able to manipulate that in a confined space and still use the bayonet was something that they taught. Breaching, yes. Mouse holding through walls. Anti-tank. We actually had an awful lot of there was an awful lot of alternative methods of anti-tank. So it wasn't just your Piat or your bazooka, but at that time tanks were still vulnerable to things like petrol bombs. We had specifically anti-tank grenades and various other things that we could use. Whereas now we're actually each of the systems is individually better. But we've got Javelin and NLAW, and some of them have issues when it comes to urban operations and minimum arming distances, etc. So yeah, in some ways we actually had more opportunities back then, more options back then for anti-armor. We didn't have any drones. I'll move on to that one. Combined arms integration. This was something that people were taught at that stage where we had various schools that people would go to, be taught up to be urban ops instructors, and then go back to their units and then teach them up as well. But then even at the staff level, we would run tactical exercises without troops. That was a fairly common occurrence. So you would see, battalion staff or divisional staff going out and just walking the ground with an instructor. They'd have some maps. The instructor would be saying, "There's an enemy positions here, here, and here. What would you do?" And actually just getting people out for a feel of the ground and actually seeing things like, well, what can you actually see if you're in that urban canyon? what could you see if you were actually trying to exploit the terrain? And yeah, you put yourself in that wonderful bell tower to be able to see everything. But guess what? That sniper's now just shot you because that was a really obvious place to be, to get better sight. So teaching people to think about that sort of thing, about how they would do that. But then how would you actually maneuver around? So whenever people went into Khan and they'd already put in those preparatory fires, then they knew how to operate alongside engineers so they can get the dozers in to clear the streets, etc., and get the tanks through. Defensive approach, the strong points and fluid defense. The Home Guard doctrine, again, absolutely nailed it right from the get-go. Historically speaking, the most successful way to defend an urban area is through fluid defense. So being able to inflict as many casualties at the point of contact and then move to the next before the enemy can then direct those supporting assets on that defensive position. And so, whereas the traditional strong point that you would sometimes see in the defense house in those training areas, especially nowadays with the evolution of things like thermobaric munitions, that's quite a concern. So, actually being able to go back to that fluid defense, and that's something they were very clear of in that original 1940-41 Home Guard doctrine, was they make the explicit reference to a building being an inferior bunker. So it's like, yes, you might feel like you're in a defensive position, but that German Mauser round is going through that single layer of brick that's on the edge of that building, or that with wooden floors and things, that they're coming through. Training, you can go back to you go to the Imperial War Museum website and you can see some of the training that actually took place. People were using live grenades, and that partly that's because the grenades were less effective than the ones we have today. But there was an element of live training. You would see people doing reasonably what we would probably deem quite dangerous training today, but that was very, very sort of standard practice at the time. The adaptation and learning was quite, I would say, given the fact they had such a strong baseline with the Home Guard doctrine, it didn't really change. And then whenever they were adapting, or when they were applying it on operations, they were then coming back and saying, "This is what we've experienced." The example you give of Ortona, after that battle, they actually turned the town of Ortona into an urban fighting school for other troops that were then deployed to Italy and were then going to carry on the rest of the campaign. So while the Canadians then fought through, some of them actually then remained back and then actually were then applying what they'd learned during that fight to the next crop of troops that were coming through. So not just training them up in the UK, but actually training them in that theatre. And then, there were actually some robotics in World War II. The Germans used the Goliath uncrewed ground vehicle, which is basically just a micro tank with a remote control. They'd pack it with explosives and drive it towards a defensive position, and then clack it off. And there was a larger version of it as well that could carry up to about 500 kilograms of explosives. So there were actually some robotics used at that point to good effect as well. But we also had other assets that could do it, things like the Churchill Avery with 165 or the dustbin thrower, the spigot mortar on the front of it, that was used for defeating defensive positions. So we didn't necessarily see the need for it, but the robotics did play a role even in 1945.
Thanks, Steve. That's a good baseline for us to then, and I think the best way to do this is to just talk about what's changed as we go through, which you've got rather a complete run through. So if we move us into the Cold War, I'm not necessarily thinking about play and so on, because what I'd like to focus on is a bit of a exceptional case of the Berlin Brigade, their focus, and then the British Army's urban training and doctrine, because that's where your subject matter expertise is going to land. So apologies for the non-Brits on, but we're going to have a bit of a homecoming session on this, because this is where we've got some knowledge. And if you can highlight what has changed more than what has stayed the same in that space, and you can mention King's Ride as well, if that would be useful.
Yeah, so in terms of what changed, we got rid of flamethrowers. So that was that was something that changed. We used flamethrowers quite a lot in World War II. We certainly had things like the crocodile tank, which was the Churchill tank that had the flamethrower adapter on it. Those were phenomenally effective at ending an urban fight before it even started, more from the psychological side of things. However, by the time we sort of started getting into the Cold War, the appetite for using that type of effect had diminished, so we didn't really have that anymore. But we did see an increase in some of the effectiveness of other weapon systems. So we had more advanced anti-armor systems. We actually had more explosive effectors in the section during the Cold War than we had today. So one of the things we used to have in the infantry section was the 66mm Law, the light anti-armor weapon, and we also had a Carl Gustaf with base loadout was 4 shots as well. So you'd have anywhere between 6 to 8 as the standard loadout of explosive launched effects that you could then deliver from a bit of a standoff during the Cold War. So actually, that was actually pretty effective. I'd love to get back to that. But we had seen, some of the other things drop off. Combined arms integration with all.
One of the changes that happened toward the end of the Cold War was we went from a 7.62 battle rifle to a 5.56 bullpup, and we also ditched the GPMG for LSW, 2 LSWs, brought it back subsequently. But any comment on how that would have been conceived different in an urban sense?
How it perceived versus what it actually achieved is 2 different things. So there was a perception that the 5.56 was a lesser round for urban fighting. In reality, actually, the 5.56 round was designed to penetrate. It was designed, so one of the reasons why it was adopted, the SS-109 5.56 round was designed to defeat Soviet soft armor and penetrate a steel helmet at 300 meters. So when you actually see the penetration data for 5.56 against common barriers in an urban area compared to 7.62, they're roughly about the same. So while everybody seems to think that you need that punchier 7.62 to get through walls, you're more likely to hit the same part of a wall with several rapid shots from a 5.56 round than a burst from a 7.62. So actually, your ability to penetrate and affect the target behind is about the same. A lot of units retained. So we had the LSW in the 80s, which was in 5.56. But a lot of units, even especially for places like Northern Ireland, we retained the 7.62 light machine gun, which was the 7.62 version of the Bren gun, and then some units retained the GPMG for that role as well. So actually, in terms of the small arms effect, there was actually only a very limited change to what you could achieve with those weapon systems. You went from 20 rounds to 30 rounds, which was a bit of a step up in terms of your ability to engage fleeting targets and suppress for longer, etc. But in terms of the overall lethality, it was roughly about the same in terms of the terminal effects. And then you could argue that the lethality went up with the S80 in the fact that every troop now had a 4 times optic. And we see now today that even there are some nations where giving somebody a 5.56 rifle with a 4 times optic makes them the designated marksman. Every infantry soldier in the British Army was given that capability. So yeah, it wasn't quite as detrimental as you might think, the mix from 5.56 to or 7.62 to 5.56.
This is also where we see the entry of the infantry fighting vehicle, a turreted infantry fighting vehicle, often with an autocannon. We also see the number of tank models reducing to sort of main battle tank, and maybe 1 other or 2 other variants, but the plethora of tank models that we have in World War II, which could be devoted to infantry assault support, tends to drop off. Is there anything in that use of IFV and autocannons, and in some cases, often the Russian example, using AAA systems in the air?
A lot of the so for the examples of the AAA, that's a bit niche in that they're usually used whenever somebody needs to fire against high-rise buildings because of elevation issues with barrels. Although occasionally you'll see people using them for high rates of fire as well. Even the Americans used that during fighting in Panama. But more sort of the standard approach. Yes, autocannons on IFVs certainly made a big difference for firepower. Arguably, they can pose more problems for a defender than a tank would, because while that tank is delivering that big 105 or 120, depending on the era, that big bang into that room is delivering one shot into one room, and then there's that dwell time in between shots. Whereas an IFV with a decent high volume autocannon can actually brass up the whole front of a building, and can suppress multiple positions, and that, whether it be 20, 25, 30 millimeter, that's still going to go through brick and any couple of sandbags that you put up behind it. So realistically, it's delivering good effect inside those target buildings. The one thing, the comparison with World War II, we did have a mix of sort of larger caliber assault guns, whether it be tank destroyers or large caliber things like the Sherman Firefly. But then a lot of the smaller the smaller calibers of the battle tanks at that time, you weren't really seeing huge effect that they were delivering inside a room. Most of them were designed for there was heat rounds and there was high explosive rounds, etc. But the actual, given the caliber and things like that, they weren't delivering a huge amount of effect into a room. So that 105 or 120 was definitely delivering a larger bang into that room. But again, there's still that dwell time and magazine capacity is still an issue for those. But yeah, IFEs with that intermediate cannon, they can actually be more dangerous. In fact, there's examples of Ukrainians in Mariupol saying that they weren't really not worried when a T-72 came around the corner, but whenever a BTR came around with a 30 millimeter, that was when they worried.
We've got to mention, because that's when we did a lot of our building of our urban training estate in the UK. So Kirkhill Down, I think Selene built in a similar sort of time frame, modelled on West German villages, harking back to that Dad's Army rural urban key point defence. Any comment on those and what that sort of led to? Because I feel this is linking back to my desperate to use my framework to our taught fort kind of model. We built an urban training area of a certain size, and that's created some potential force lessons in our training system and alive when we've run people through that.
It has. I mean, it was less. The lessons were actually quite relevant at the time that they were built. The intention behind Copill Down was they wanted to create that as you say, that West German village, but the intention was that light forces would use that to do a delaying action of defending from that village against a Soviet armored force that was maneuvering around it or trying to punch through. And so they would use actually, we were inspired by Operation Goodwood in World War II, where the Germans were defending those smaller towns and villages. And while not necessarily fighting too hard to hold the village, what they were doing is they were using the village to shield things like forward observers and artillery, so they could then put attrition on the advancing Allied forces on the way to those villages. So Copill Down was us effectively trying to solidify a Goodwood-style defensive operation, but we were now in the position that the Germans were in. And trying to use things like Milan and artillery observers to then affect the Soviets on the outskirts of Copill Down on the approaches. So actually, from that perspective, that Copill Down was actually very effective at delivering that. It's when we have subsequently tried to then use it for teaching other things where it kind of falls down. And going back to your sort of thought and taught diagram, there are very clear limitations of what you can actually represent in a live training environment. There's very strong limitations on things like through wall effects and suppression, and your ability to employ things like joint fires or even mortars, which are all crucial assets for a combined arms urban fight. But if you can't represent those, what you end up doing is you do an infantry assault, and there happens to be a tank there that's firing blank from the commander's coax, and then you still then do the break-in battle into a building, and then you're doing a CQB fight inside because your Op 4 has been told to defend it, because that's what they've been told to do. And so they then fight it and defend all of the rooms, and you have to clear every single room, fighting a defender who's willing to then stay there and fight to the death. In reality, once you kind of get towards a building, that's usually when the defender sort of says, right, this is getting a bit spicy. We've had a lot of suppression applied to us. We're going to leave and we're going to go somewhere else. So you don't necessarily always end up with that CQB fight inside all of the rooms. So in some ways, the way we're using it now, and because of the limitations of what we can actually represent, that's when we're starting to creep in some of those false lessons. So some of the lessons around things like how the amount of attrition you're likely to achieve or to experience in an urban assault, etc. Those things come from some of those limitations of training. But the original envisaged use of co-build-down was actually quite spot on for the Cold War British Army of the Rhine. Interestingly, when we were training at the same time, we were training members of the British military to go over to Northern Ireland and do support to military assistance to the civil authority. So working with the police over there, we had different training areas that they used. So you had the Tin Town villages and Lyddon Hyde and various other places where you would actually then they were more set up to look like a normal town. And people would then learn things like patrol tactics and different sort of counter-terrorism scenarios, etc. And Down was used for BAUR training for when the balloon goes up and you're waiting for that big bucket of sunshine.
Yeah, I suppose also to highlight that we were largely thinking about being on the defensive in the Cold War, and therefore our approach, this is our thought aspect. Our approach to urban areas was defensive, and then we also would have time to prepare, or we could pick where we were going to defend, so we could get all the stuff ready, and that might have led us to a fascination with strong points versus a more fluid defense. I don't know if you want to focus on that, because certainly I was still being taught the strong point model, which felt a bit silly given the amount of energy and effort to fortify one house, the amount of firepower that we put into that house, which would defeat the human being inside the house, whether the house was still standing or not, was relevant by this point. So I don't know if you've got some thoughts on where that came from.
Yeah, I think that is something that crept in over time after the Cold War. During the Cold War, people were very much taught that defense house that's set up. There's on most of the urban training areas, there is a building called the defense house. And it's an exemplar building that's been built by the Royal Engineers to show all of the different ways that you can fortify a building. There'll be, you've blocked up the entryways, you've ringed it with barbed wire, razor wire, you've set up fighting positions deep inside the room, you've blocked entranceways and all that sort of thing. And it looks like something out of Mad Max. And the purpose behind that, you might even have seen some diagrams of like sort of cutaway buildings where they've shown these sorts of things. The purpose of that defense house was to show all of the different things that you could do to a building in order to provide it with an element of fortification, or give it some more resilience against an enemy that's firing sort of unguided artillery into the general sort of vicinity. It was never designed to be, this is how you should prepare a building. And interestingly, when the Home Guard talk about a strong point, they talk about an entire, like a junction or an entire street is the strong point where they think that the enemy is going to be going into initially, and they will refer to that as the strong point, not a single building. And the intention would be that actually you would be moving between multiple prepared firing positions in multiple buildings, and so while you might not necessarily have one building that's done up all like that, there might be one room within one building where you've really heavily fortified that one room, and then you've done the same in a different room in a different building, and then you've mouseholed a route from that building A to building B, so that once you've fired from one building, while the enemy thinks that you're in there and they're starting to sort of move towards it, you're then actually in the other building and you're then being able to attack them from a flank. So that was how the original envisage of strong pointing was, and that's actually what we were teaching in during the Cold War. And it's post-Cold War when some of those TTPs started to get less frequently employed and less frequently taught, and people were just kind of not necessarily guessing, but they were inferring the wrong lessons. And it kind of goes back to your point that there was no thought, but there then was some thought, and then there was taught, and it wasn't necessarily based on the experience.
Yes, yeah. I'm thinking of a non-urban example of, it's a bit like the combat estimate has grown from a very hasty appreciation to this very exotic and intellectual activity because it's been iteratively added to, and because there's no thought to thought link, we've just kind of gone thought, and we've
Mhm.
like a lot of like tax law, isn't it? Like, you know, you start off with one tax law, and then now you've got a law for everything. So that would make sense, especially if you've got, this is no slight on anyone who's got a day job being paid to be an urban person, but if you're the urban training estate guru, then you can afford to make this urban estate look that particular way, strong points, and then you run people through it, and people want to get the best experience out of it. So you can almost end up reinforcing that loop unintentionally, especially if you've got a pre-built defense house and you haven't got time on the exercise to, you know, one of the big lessons for me was trying to do that on an exercise. And I was like, we've wasted most of the exercise, wasted. We've had an experience in fatigue and working out, lifting stuff, and trying to build a house to the level which the demo house is. And the adversary force wasn't really playing it particularly well, and just basically roll us up. And I was like, I haven't really felt like we've learned. I would have preferred to have skirmished through all these buildings than to actually spend 4 days not sleeping building this up.
Well, the guys who teach it now, so I teach on the Urban Operations Instructors course, and the training team there are very switched on about this now. So one of the things that they've actually they'd spent a long time trying to figure out how to do it properly in the training estate that they had. And then they realised that actually it wasn't viable to do a proper fluid defence in some of the training estates that were available. So they now take that the Urban Ops Instructors course is a 3-week course. The middle week is where they do defensive operations, and that middle week is now done in a disused industrial area outside a medium-sized city in England, and it gives them a large enough area that they can actually do a fighting withdrawal through that urban terrain, and doing a little bit of prep to some of those buildings, but more that kind of light touch enough to survive that initial contact and then move to the next location. So they are actually, yeah, over the last couple of years, they've really been trying to learn those lessons from the past, learn the lessons from history, reinvigorate the old doctrine and the reasons behind it. That's the crucial bit, the reasons why it was taught that way, and actually then now work around some of the limitations of the training areas.
Okay, with that, we'll move into GWOT, and I think I'll just kick us off. You got to talk about close quarter battle and stacking. We've got to hit this.
Yeah. So this was something that very much was emerging through the peacekeeping operations in the 90s, but really hit the ground running in the early 2000s. In that 90, you mentioned earlier on, there was the Black Hawk Down incident as well, and so you had the Delta guys and the Rangers who were learning from the Delta guys, etc. So there was this sort of fascination with learning those types of skills. We saw an awful lot of SF special forces tactics then becoming mainstream within the infantry urban clearance tactics, to the point where you even see things like the Americans have got the set battle drill 6 for how to enter and clear a room, and it's a very dynamic entry, which is sort of the modern term for it is a dynamic entry. So that coin, those coin, the context of the coin operations, those restrictive ROE, you're operating alongside civilians, you're doing very targeted operations against key individuals, etc. They drove the thinking around CQB tactics, and then the limitations of actually being able to practice combined arms, high intensity urban operations led people to lean more into CQB and reinforce it even more, because actually with the training estate you've got, what's an easy thing to do? Well, it's training CQB. I mean, you could even do that in your own barrack block. So it really kind of it took on a life of its own. It reinforced everything. You had all the fascination with special operations forces throughout the GWOT, and then they were obviously talking about, you know, all their CQB tactics, etc. You can still, it's still is today. You go on YouTube and you're inundated with videos of ex special forces or special operations forces guys talking about CQB tactics. As I mentioned earlier, that obsession led to some quite painful lessons for people like, you know, the U.S. Army and U.S. Marine Corps going in during the Second Battle of Fallujah, and because that's what the focus had been on their training, that's what they then tried to do. You know, you don't raise your standards to your level of expectation; you lower it to the level of your training. In reality, so what was then happening was guys were going in, and because they'd been practicing CQB, they just did CQB, and it wasn't relevant for that fight in Fallujah. It might have been relevant 2 months before if they were in a different part of Iraq and they were doing arrest operations, but there was that inability to, because they hadn't been training for multiple scenarios, they weren't thinking about how to have transitions between different tactics. So CQB really sort of hit a proverbial brick wall for the infantry during the Second Battle of Fallujah, and there's been a number of instances since then as well. But because of those limitations in training, because of that obsession with special operations, it kind of just perpetuated even after that. We saw that, you know, in the UK, a lot of the training on that side of things was led by those guys. There were some of the TTPs of how you enter and then actually enter a room was very much taking those sort of hostage rescue TTPs. Wasn't really relevant for that conventional fight. Again, the team that are leading the training now at the Infantry Battle School, they've recognised that, and they've very much moved away from that and have done for quite a few years now. But there's still this lingering, and a lot of units are left to the, you know, they run the training themselves. A lot of, you know, junior infantry leaders run the training themselves, and so there's an element where these things, because they are so popular and because they're accessible through things like YouTube. People are practicing them, and you see some absolute howlers. You see guys doing the stack with a one-handed rifle pointed up at a window in a room while trying to cross an open area in between buildings. It's like you're intentionally putting 3 or 4 guys together in a big bunch and then running across an open space, and you're just presenting a very large target for somebody to engage. There's an awful lot of things where we're seeing these things being misapplied. So it's something we're trying to change, very much so. But you know, the military, every military, we see it. It's not just the British military, the Americans, the French, Germans. You know, militaries are like slow-moving oil tankers. They don't change things very quickly unless they're forced to.
Yeah, I've got plenty of examples of videos of people forming the stack outside of the, well, not even just outside of the building, but outside of the urban, where a lot of our training estate, you start in the woods and then you punch in, and they're in the stack in the woods doing effectively a SWAT train maneuver. And again, if you're not instrumented and you've not got good umpires, you don't get that feedback. Or especially if it's the style of the exiles, people don't want to kill anyone because the training value is yet to be squeezed from the training lemon. But yeah, it's frustrating. And then in building effects, you've already mentioned, you know, the idea of stacking up outside a room. Well, the urban training estate is concrete, which is fantastic, but most buildings these days are very cheaply produced, and you will get through wall effects, and that's not being replicated. And like I say, the drill, and equally, because it's not being replicated, the person on the inside, the adversary, is not practicing that drill either. So even if you had an umpire, they wouldn't necessarily rule on it because it's not happening. So you're creating all these feedback loops that are arguably neutering our urban reality for the sake of giving a very and very good on video. Because there are a lot of recruitment videos I've seen show urban CQB.
Yeah, it looks cool.
You know, with smoke. It looks great, and you know, and this is where you know the media, as in films and TV series, with, you know, terminal list, seals, you know, all that sort of stuff. It looks great, and people think that's what I want to be. 3/4 sleeves, you know, punching through some corridors. But unfortunately, it's effectively military cosplaying to the reality that most people in the military in the urban environment are going to have to face, which is very messy, frag everywhere, you know, dust, smoke, trying to do
Yeah.
CQB when you're walking over bricks that are uneven, all this sort of reality, which I feel just gets lost. So it's a bit of scar tissue for me because I came up under the
I
old
mean,
system.
in the interest of balance, I will say that we do need to learn how to move through buildings and clear them safely. There is an element of CQB that is about command and control and the safe sectors of fire and that sort of thing. So those things do still need to be taught because not every building is going to be occupied by the enemy, whether it be an insurgent or a conventional peer threat. So but you do still need to be able to safely move through and make sure that those buildings are cleared. So you even during the Second Battle of Fallujah, there were instances of a company spending 2 days just clearing building after building after building, and not necessarily getting into contact. But then there's that one time when they do. So the CQB tactics, I think they do have relevance. They just shouldn't be the focal point. It's like if somebody only learned how to do arrowhead formation and then tried to do that whenever they got into really dense forests, and they ended up losing half the platoon. So it's just understanding when's it relevant and to what levels you need to go to. Do you really need to go nth degree about what type of shoes are you wearing because can you pivot quickly and all that sort of stuff, right? It's like you're kind of you're getting ahead of yourself, really.
Yeah, yeah. I suppose that's where maybe CQM had more value than what I was broadly describing as CQB, where the first thing is everyone needs to get a stat. But yes, I think that speaks back to the idea of people need to understand the logic behind the drill, because then
Mhm.
the thoughts are taught. And I had an example of being on an exercise with the Indians in India, and our guys were stacking in twos, and the Indians weren't stacking in twos. And one of the things I pointed out to the Brits who were sort of critiquing this, I was like, well, you've got front and back and side body armor. These guys don't, because we're in the Himalayas. So it's like they don't really do body armor up there because it's going to make you a heat casualty. So I was like, so them standing one behind the other is not providing the same level of smaller target and same protection as it is for you guys. And they've also got longer battle rifles than your carbines, so they need to spread out. Otherwise, they can't cross cover. And again, just getting them to think through it as opposed to like, why aren't they doing it like we're doing it? And I feel some of the sort of ways things are taught from that soft fetishization, sort of people aren't doing aren't looking behind the curtain and going, why are they doing it like that? As opposed to like, that must be the right way in every circumstance. But you cover that well. Is there anything else? I suppose what we need to cover is IEDs, and especially VBIEDs, because that's the delivery of HE through often remote or terminal means, which is not something we practice, but it can practice against us, which has created more of a threat to both being in a building and being in the roadway. And you see that more in the ISIS campaign. But the idea of not using doorways, not using windows, making your own entry and all that stuff. So maybe this would be a good point to talk through that, because it does have logic into conventional, but it's been applied for more force protection reasons than for getting the knock on somebody in that building.
Yeah, I mean that's a bit big topic, big question. So in terms of IEDs, obviously the complexity of the terrain amplifies the sheer number of options somebody who wants to emplace IEDs can put them in. The the level of um, evil ingenuity that Daesh was able to seed IEDs into urban areas in places like Raqqa and Mosul shocked even people who had spent quite a significant amount of time in Iraq and Afghanistan before. Um, so that notion of, do you even need to go in? Can you clear the building as much as possible, even from the outside? This leads on to things like the exploitation of uncrewed systems, being able to use UAS to be able to fly around and at least give a high level of assurance before you start trying to make entry. Are the things you can do that can mitigate some of the risks? Obviously, we try and teach people that if you're going to assault a building, you don't necessarily want to go through the main entryways. There's the fatal funnel of the front door, blow a hole in the wall and go through a mouse hole that way. But if this is your 60th building in the last couple of days that you've had to breach into, you're going to run out of breaching charges pretty quickly. So what else could you do? Can you prep a doorway by standoff firing a 40mm grenade from your grenade launcher into the doorway? And at least then you've given yourself a level of assurance that that doorway is clear, and you can then build on that from that point onwards. We've seen that play out in real time. But when it comes to things like you mentioned, the suicide vehicle-borne IEDs, that was a huge concern during the Battle of Mosul, to the point where the Americans even started dropping 500-pound bombs onto side roads of the roads that they knew the Iraqis were going to try and use. So if the Iraqi convoy was going to go up, High Street, the Americans would, just prior to that advance taking place, would then drop 500-pound bombs on each of the approach routes either side of it to try and mitigate the options for SVB IEDs actually being able to come and hit the Iraqi convoy. It became that much of a problem. Obviously, that had huge implications for stockpiles and collateral damage. It's not something that's probably sustainable for anybody other than the Americans. But the point is that that's how significant a threat that particular tactic became. So having some form of very persistent ISTAR and responsive Overwatch capability is really quite important. So if you can't do that, there are other things. Being able to deny roads, even if it's just temporarily. So do we have things that we can employ as you're moving forward, and you come across a side road, rather than just putting somebody there covering it with a GPMG? Is there something you can do that can go 20 meters further down the road and actually have something that you can place and block? Is there something you can do like that? Those are things that we're trying to get people to think about, and are those the type of capabilities that we would actually want to generate? But also things like, as unfortunate it was for our allies to be on the receiving end of those SVB IEDs, it's a learning point for us in saying, well, if we're then trying to do an assault through an urban area and it is so hotly contested, and there are challenges with things like employing your joint fires capability, do we want to then have something like a small robotic system with an explosive warhead on it that we can employ? We've seen in Ukraine both sides using UAS with thermobaric warheads on them, and being employed by tactical elements on the ground. So you see that a building has been occupied, and then you fly a thermobaric warhead drone through the window, and you defeat that defensive position. You don't have to then do the infantry fight for that reason alone. So yes, it was a big problem. We were on the receiving end of, at the tail end of the global war on terror, and into the counter Daesh operations. But actually, the stuff we can learn from that and saying, actually, this is potentially a capability we might want to generate ourselves. Obviously, doing it slightly more within the law of armed conflict than Daesh was.
Yeah, so that's bringing us up to the recent wars. And I think we've got to talk about drones that fly. And again, one of the best descriptors I've had of the sort of recent times is getting the GWOT era and being like, so IEDs fly now. And you think like, oh my God.
Yeah, they fly now.
The nightmare has come true. So how is this changing? I've got a slide on continental changes to sum up, but how are drones changing the urban fights? And you can take this for UGVs, UAS, and then FPVs and launch missions and all that stuff.
Well, we haven't seen a huge. We have seen some UGVs, uncrewed ground vehicles. We haven't seen an awful lot of them. They haven't been extensive. Throughout the Syrian civil war, we saw an awful lot. Not an awful lot. We saw it wasn't uncommon to see a remote weapon station being employed for urban defense. And that's quite useful in the fact that you can put a remote weapon station in a position that you wouldn't want to put a human soldier. You could put multiple in multiple locations and have them controlled by a single operator, who could take over one that had line of sight, and when they didn't have line of sight, they could move to a different system and use that one. So we've seen some of those, and that's definitely things that that could be useful for us, especially for smaller militaries that are trying to cover. That the urban environment provides so many maneuver avenues of approach for an attacking force. If you're defending it, then being able to cover multiple positions with as few people as possible is genuinely useful. In terms of UGVs, they're constrained by your control mechanisms. So the urban terrain gets in the way of comms. So if something's remote controlled, that does add an element of reliability concern with a UGV. And can it actually maneuver through the space? Is it going to fall over on rubble? Is it going to flip? All those sorts of things, right? So UGVs are actually quite problematic. One of the things that I loathe, and people laugh because I just constantly ranting on Twitter about those robot dogs, and people putting a machine gun on a robot dog. I think that's the most absurd thing that I've ever seen, but we see that quite frequently. Having watched those things fall over on a flat surface, the notion of putting a fully automatic belt-fed weapon on top of one of them and saying, "Yeah, we're good," just terrifies me. So UGVs, they've got a place to they've got a role to play. But I think UAS, uncrewed air systems, are definitely the way that we're clearly seeing their use exploding in recent years. The big implications of those are: can you provide a level of assurance before you enter buildings, so you're taking less risk with your infantry to actually go in and clear? Can you deliver standoff effects? So rather than having to move forward, suppress a building, and then take risk by standing up and firing and structure munition, even to give you a bit of a standoff effect, can you deliver that from 2 streets away and you're not even in line of sight? Those are absolutely credible capabilities, and they're stuff that we're looking at the moment. But the real dramatic implication is cam and concealment and deception. So camouflage, concealment, deception, and dispersion, those are the things that we're seeing as being the absolute lessons to be learned about UAS and the various effects that they can deliver. So the good old survivability onion, if everybody's aware of the survivability onion, the first thing is don't be there. Okay, well, you got to be there because you got to defend it. So the next thing is, don't be found, don't be seen. So if you can remove that high-flying UAS's ability to identify your position, then you mitigate the chances of them being able to then say, right, well, that's where they are. Now I'm going to fly in a UAS with a thermobaric on it, and then suddenly that preparatory fire is now very precise and it's very effective. So camouflage, concealment of your actual fighting positions, covered movements between covered routes between buildings. Can you exploit subterranean spaces? Can you exploit other means to go between buildings? Could you put if you've got a small alleyway between buildings, can you put a big biffa bin in between them and then mouse hole through the wall, through the bin, into the next building? Can you think about all those sort of clever ways that you could exploit the terrain? And soldiers are brilliant at coming up with nifty little ways of being able to do these things. Dispersion, so not having all your force concentrated. Again, if there is a threat from UAS with thermobaric munitions, putting an entire section in a single building just ups your chances of having a catastrophic loss. So I think those are really kind of the big influences of robotic autonomous systems that we've seen over the last sort of 10 years.
Yeah, I'm thinking that sort of one of the things we didn't cover explicitly, but this idea of attacking buildings versus shaping them. What I mean by that is often that you get your Fallujah urban map and it's got a building numbers 1 to 50 on it. Very much the plan is to take a building number, then shoot at another building number, then take another building number. When we do wood and forest fighting, the first thing we do is put stops down on the side to engage enemy fleeing from the wood. Don't seem to necessarily have the same mechanical approach to urban, which I believe they had in World War II. They were trying to flush, because again, the Germans knew you were going to first actual charge, so they would try and exit before you came in, and therefore you flush them out and you get them as they're flushed into an area that you've got gunfire on. And the proliferation of drones means that you can now have drones both providing stops from from a ISR perspective, but also potentially with a strike perspective, and you can effectively isolate the building of interest, whether you're going to clear it with humans or clear it with HE more easily. I mean, at least that's something to me which is becoming more of utility than when you were just basically going from building to building to building to building, which is quite obvious what you're doing, and therefore opens you up to being thermobaric or IED or hit with precision or whatever else you want to do, because you're being very mechanical about it.
Yeah, there's different ways you can apply different TTPs, but isolation, you could do that at the macro level for that town or that village, or that city. You'd like to isolate the city. We isolated Mosul before the ground campaign started. The Russians isolated Mariupol before they really kind of went in and tried to clear it all out. In fact, one of the reasons, one of the decision points for the Ukrainians leaving Bakhmut was whenever they thought it was going to lose the flanks and therefore be isolated. So isolation at that macro level is absolutely a driver for the next phase of an urban operation, because what we've seen historically is that if you don't isolate it, and the enemy can get reinforcements forward, get the casualties out, get resupplies in, etc., then that really prolongs and intensifies the nature of that defense. So isolation at a macro level, but even at that the micro tactical level as well. If you're going to assault a particular building, you do want to try and isolate it as much as possible. There's going to be a limit to how much you can do, because you might have to then clear multiple other buildings in order to then isolate and actually get around all four sides of a building. So it's not necessarily feasible. But as you mentioned, if you can isolate with other methods, it doesn't have to be physical isolation by having it encircled. But if you have it isolated with I-star and fires on the approaches that you can't then engage with direct fire, then you're limiting the options for those defenders, and you're giving them that chance to be able to say, well, actually, do I want to carry on this fight, or do I want to just surrender and say, okay, yeah, you got me, Gov. We'll surrender, because those are perfectly viable options. They're fairly consistent throughout history as well. Once a defender finds themselves isolated, whether it be physically or they've been cut off through fires and containment fires, etc., don't know where to go to next, then they're left with the decision of, well, do I stay and try and fight it out, or do I surrender and hopefully try and live to fight another day? And that's something that does happen quite frequently.
Well, that's been a great counter through. I'm going to try and move us to our. I have some videos which I won't be showing, but I will put in the links up in the show notes, which cover various examples of this training through history. Because we're now at the 90-minute point, I want to get us to some questions from those on the Zoom call. So this is a summary of continuity and change. And I've prepared this before Stuart's on, so if anything clashes, that's all on me. Anything you want to highlight on here before we ask some questions from the audience?
I think you're absolutely right. Urban combat is still close, violent, and infantry-led. The nature of that terrain, even when you've got I-star US flying and you've got precision fires, because of the nature of the terrain, that defender can exploit, as much as we talked about camouflage and concealment, etc. They can actually exploit that and hide themselves. So you do end up still having to have infantry move forward and clear things. As much as people are fetishizing drones now in the way that we used to fetishize special operations tactics, the notion of a drone being able to give you 100% assurance that an enemy is no longer in a building, it's just not really there. So you will still need to move forward. You will still need to enter buildings. You will still need to fight in that street. So yeah, that's absolutely true. I contend the point about defender retaining. Sorry, I would agree that the defender retains an advantage, but the defender doesn't have the advantage, and that's one of the key things that I think people people do believe about urban operations. So yes, they do retain an advantage because they are able to exploit that terrain for cam and concealment, and then being able to effectively choose when to initiate contact and where. But yeah, they still find it very, very difficult to actually defend a proper urban area. It's still very, very challenging for a defender. Progress can be slow and costly. It depends on the nature of the fight. So we've seen urban ops just drag on for months at a time, like Mosul. But we've also seen some pretty rapid ones as well. So the Russians took Severodonetsk within a week, but even that included back and forward operations by both sides. So they're not all going to go down the route of being slow and costly. The Americans took Baghdad with most of the fighting was over in 3 days, and that was the nation's capital, defended by the Fedi and Saddam and the Republican Guard. Yeah, it might absolutely necessary, I agree with if you're talking about the shift to conventional warfighting, I'd say yeah, precision and mass is the thing again, and it's how do you get both? At the moment, people are leaning towards UAS to generate both. So you can actually have your cake and eat it if you're willing to take some risk on them not being high precision assets or large warhead ones. Yeah, linear movement, dispersion, concealment. Again, that kind of depends. We saw some really interesting TTPs during things like Second Battle of Fallujah and other more modern examples. We've seen things like armor forces being able to punch forward, doing like a thunder run, just even for 100 meters or two, and then holding that position, and then the infantry then doing a back clear. So the enemy is thinking their fighting positions are facing one way, and then the enemy basically punches past them and then comes and attacks them from the rear. It's a difficult one to try and coordinate because you got things like cross boundary fires, and you could now be firing back towards your lines. But yeah, there could be some interesting TTPs we have seen that don't necessarily make it quite such a kind of steady progression. Yeah. I think I agree with everything else there.
Awesome. I think as ever, there's looking for blanket answers. Seems to be the fool's errand. So again, this was my attempt to provide a summary. But as you've done there, there's a lot of nuance still to be found. So I'm going to open it up now for anyone on the Zoom. If you want to unmute and ask a question, or if you don't want to speak, then you can put it in the chat. Luckily, I have someone reserved. If you don't know anyone who wants to come forward. Okay, Stu, which army is leading the field in its approach to urban tactics?
I think that would depend on what bit of it. So I think the U.S. Marine Corps did an awful lot to think about how you do the street fight and the combined arms fight as opposed to doing the CQB side of things. They learned a lot after Second Fallujah and other operations. And they put a lot of time and effort into it as well. So we saw the U.S. Marine Corps really leaning into it and doing that. We have seen episodic interest across the U.S. Army as well in this. So they, we've seen, but it's usually been in sort of small parcels. It's not been consistent. In terms of conventional forces and TTPs, I would say I'll be slightly biased here and say that the British have really gripped this. The leaders in terms of the conventional employment at CQB would definitely be the Royal Marines. They've leaned into that exceptionally heavily. But in terms of the integration of combined arms at company level, the British Army have done a phenomenal job. The problem is we don't necessarily get to train it as well as we should, and that's where we've seen some things where we've gone off to other urban training areas like Senzu with the French and seen the setup that the French have got and gotten jealous of them because they have a permanently deployed armor force that's actually at Senzu that they can use either as the op4 or as a support element. So those would be really, really good to have. So there are some elements of that. The Germans have built a really excellent urban training area, quite a large one. So there's there's some competition, but in terms of things like thinking about the doctrine, doing things like the urban wargaming to train at subunit to unit level and brigade level, I think that the British Army is nailing that one more than anyone else. I don't see as many other nations doing that, and actually a lot of the other nations are coming over to see what we're doing in that regard.
Okay, I've got a question for me. Audience about CSS, which we've not massively touched on, other than PGM stocks, but it's a constant constraint in any environment. So
Yes.
urban is no exception. But possibly the demand for munitions and just the physical difficulty of getting stuff forward and backwards. Do you think anything's coming along to change that, or is that a sort of ethereal, permanent nature of that?
So we are seeing an increase in interest in this is within DSTL. We're seeing an increasing interest in people wanting to understand CSS and sustainment. So we've been doing an awful lot of sustainment, wargaming, and analysis on behalf of the army, looking at it from that sort of macro operational level. And theatre level of how do you actually get there and sustain the full fight at brigade and division level. What we haven't seen is a more focused deep dive on urban CSS, and it is something that I obviously love to see. But even things like understanding if we had to defend a given urban area, the class 4 supplies, what are going to be the demands for that? So we're going to genuinely try and put in a fluid defense and have multiple defensible positions. What are the class 4 supply demands? What are likely to be the casualty rates that we experience, and how do we do that? How do we do that CASEVAC? We've seen some experimentation with things like heavy lift UAS for being able to overcome that urban the degraded urban area and the rubble, and being able to try and move people back quickly. But obviously that's there's some context in there about contested airspace, etc. So we have been thinking about it, but it certainly could do with more of a focus. It has been something that I have raised before. So you're not alone if you're worried about a lack of thinking about CSS. It is a growing concern, and it is something we're focusing on more in DSTL.
Okay, where do you stand on specialized urban platoons, companies, or battalions? So an extreme example is you've got the 10th Mountain Division. This is what one of John Spencer's points. Like, there's no 11th Urban Division, but the British Army did have a design for the phalanx platoon, which I know wasn't just for urban. It was meant to be a more optimized platoon than the current one. But where do you sit conceptually on the idea of becoming specialists, is in task organized in barracks for urban versus this idea of you're a generalist goal flag and you just have to work it out, figure it out wherever you go?
So cards on the table, I'm all for it. Now, I understand the reasons why people are against it. People think that it should be everybody has a dog in this fight, so everybody should be trained up for it, and I agree with that. But I would go back to you can even look at those big examples, things like World War II, where we had those large armies, we were able to bypass and avoid urban areas. But even within those, where everyone was still trained in urban TTPs, and we had multiple street fighting or town fighting schools who were teaching the regular army how to do these things, we still had units. There were certain units that were designated as second echelon who were going to come through and clear those urban areas, and they were given additional training in Fallujah. So one of the most well-known ones is the King's Own Scottish Borders. They were given enhanced Fallujah training, and they were used as that sort of specialist force for those missions and tasks. So while the regular units would then sort of bypass and avoid, the KOSB and the others like it would then be brought forward to then do that assault into the cities and actually take them. So we have form for doing it. We have form currently for doing it for other environments. So we have the Royal Marines specialised in mountain and Arctic warfare. The Gurkhas specialised in jungle warfare. So we already do that with other environments within the British military. Does that stop anybody else going off somewhere where it's cold? No. Does it stop other people going off and doing jungle warfare training? No, absolutely not. But if something was to kick off in either of those environments, we would have a core cohort of specialists in a formation. But not just that, but over time you then get that diffusion of knowledge who would go across other parts of the force. So a Royal Marine officer over time will then spend, we have Royal Marine officers embedded within conventional army brigades, and 3 div as well. So that proliferation of that knowledge would then spread across other parts of the force over time. We see contemporaries also have this. So again, for other environments, there's multiple units or multiple nations that maintain mountain troops or troops that are specialized for jungle warfare. But Finland has the Jaeger Regiment, who specialize in the defense of Helsinki. So they're the urban specialists for the Finnish army. And then their secondary role is to then train the rest of the army in urban TTPs, so they can then defend their towns and villages in their sectors for defense. So there is form for this, both historically in the British Army and contemporary, not just in Britain, but otherwise. So I would be absolutely all for this. You could then attach officers and senior NCOs from those units. If another unit was going to go off and do an urban thing, you can then have this cohort that you can then embed within and spread some of that knowledge around in the way that we would do with the mountain leaders if somebody else was going to go to Mountain Arctic. So yeah, I'm all for it.
Thanks. Well, thank you for that. I'm trying to force your hand out. There's definitely going to be division of opinion in this. It's been my observation, though, that in this currently resource constrained and time and attention deficit economy, that even just going into the field rural has become a specialism. And like so many troops are not even getting out to do that because of all the constraints. So if it means we get something trained to some level, I'm all for it. As this goes this idea that everyone's going to train in everything. So I think we're just not getting that even in constructive simulation. It's proving difficult to give people an offset in that.
I think another thing that was genuinely useful for food for thought would be the role of reserves in this. You mentioned about being able to access the even rural training areas, and then what do you do when you get there, and how do you move around? Our reserve units, our reserve infantry units, generally don't have access to much in the way of mounted platforms to do mobility training and that sort of thing. Have they got the funds to be making multiple trips to those established rural training areas even? But actually, a lot of them are based in and around towns and cities and villages. So you can actually say, well, you've got those links into the local area. You've got potential access to training on private land, topple, as the sort of military likes to call it. Can you say, just in the same way that we did with the Home Guard, and say, your focus is going to be on defending towns and villages? Could we then say to the reserves, your focus is on training for urban operations on the infantry side of things? And then again, if something was to kick off and we had to rapidly grow the military, could you then use them as a sort of seed corner capability to spread those TTPs in the wider force? So that's yeah, and also potential food for thought.
Great. Well, trying to do an urban webinar in under 2 hours is proved elusive, but it's been very. No, it's not your fault. It's entirely great content and meeting. I think we've kind of shaved 4 webinars on 4 different periods into one now, which is great. Final question from me. Got to ask, because this is gaming, wargaming enterprise. What would be your recommendation if somebody wanted to get into explore the topics we discussed at the tactical level in some form of a game? It could be digital or analog. I won't have a personal bias either way. What would you suggest they purchase off the shelf or they download online?
Okay, so for the tactical level, there is an obvious winner here, which is the Urban Operations game. So it's literally just called Urban Operations. It was designed by an officer who taught at the French urban training area at Senzu. Now there are some gamisms. You can game the rules in a few places, but in terms of the ability to accurately represent the proper street fight, not just the CQB side of things, or you're putting a whole combined arms company group actually into an urban area and fighting against multiple different types of opponents with different rule sets. Then I'd say urban operations is probably the bee's knees for training from sort of section up to company level. I don't think yeah, you could probably play some bolt action games and various other bits and pieces, but in terms of something that's going to be relevant for a training audience, it was literally designed by the guy who was training the French army for this specifically for this reason. So yeah, I think you'd struggle to find something else that would fit the bill quite as well as urban operations. They just put out a second edition of it last year as well, so Yeah, I've got the first edition. So yeah, I'm feeling slightly old school with my version.
Yeah, and I'm having not played it, but certainly researched it. It's got a number of scenarios across the breadth of
Yep.
the eras we talked about. It doesn't necessarily link the counters to a specific era. That's what we have unit cards for. So you can use one game to play everything from sort of early Cold War to modern.
Yeah.
Great. Well, Steve, thanks for coming on. Appreciate it. Keep up the good work on the urban side. Keep banging that drum. And hopefully you've got a few more converts to the cause, both in Zoom and on YouTube.
Cheers, Ed. Thanks for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Cheers, Ed. Thanks.